Section 13 of Lives of the Saints with Reflections for Every Day of the Year by Rev. Alban Butler. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. June 16th. St. John Francis Regis. St. John Francis Regis was born in Languedoc in 1597. From his tenderest years he showed evidences of uncommon sanctity by his innocence of life, modesty, and love of prayer. At the age of 18 he entered the Society of Jesus. As soon as his studies were over he gave himself entirely to the salvation of souls. The winter he spent in country missions, principally in mountainous districts, and in spite of the rigors of the weather and the ignorance and roughness of the inhabitants, he labored with such success that he gained innumerable souls to God, both from heresy and from a bad life. The summer he gave to the towns. There his time was taken up in visiting hospitals and prisons, in preaching and instructing, and in assisting all who in any way stood in need of his services. In his works of mercy God often helped him by miracles. In November 1637 the Saint set out for his second mission at Martha's. His road lay across valleys filled with snow and over mountains frozen and precipitous. In climbing one of the highest, a bush to which he was clinging gave way, and he broke his leg in the fall. By the help of his companion he accomplished the remaining 6 miles, and then, instead of seeing a surgeon, insisted on being taken straight to the confessional. There, after several hours, the curate of the parish found him still seated, and when his leg was examined the fracture was found to be miraculously healed. He was so inflamed with the love of God that he seemed to breathe, think, speak of that alone, and he offered up the holy sacrifice with such attention and fervor that those who assisted at it could not but feel something of the fire with which he burned. After 12 years of unceasing labor, he rendered his pure and innocent soul to his Creator at the age of 45. Reflection. When St. John Francis was struck in the face by a sinner whom he was reproving, he replied, "If you only knew me, you would give me much more than that." His meekness converted the man, and it is in this spirit that he teaches us to win souls to God. How much might we do if we could forget our own wants in remembering those of others, and put our trust in God. June 17th. St. Avitus, Abbot. St. Avitus was a native of Orleans, and retiring into Auvergne, took the monastic habit, together with St. Calais, in the Abbey of Menat, at that time very small, though afterward enriched by Queen Brunhilde, and by St. Boner, Bishop of Clermont. The two saints soon after returned to Misky, a famous abbey situated a league and a half below Orleans. It was founded toward the end of the reign of Clovis I by St. Euspicius, a holy priest, honored on the 14th of June, and his nephew St. Maximin, or Mesnim, whose name this monastery, which is now of the Cistercian order, bears. Many call St. Maximin the first abbot, others St. Euspicius the first, St. Maximin the second, and St. Avitus the third. But our saint and St. Calais made not a long stay at Misky, though St. Maximin gave them a gracious reception. In quest of a closer retirement, St. Avitus, who had succeeded St. Maximin, soon after resigned the abbacy, and with St. Calais lived a recluse in the territory now called Dunois, on the frontiers of Le Perche. Others joining them, St. Calais retired into a forest in Maine, and King Clotaire built a church and monastery for St. Avitus and his companions. This is at present a Benedictine nunnery called St. Avy of Châteaudun, and is situated on the Loire, at the foot of the hill on which the town of Châteaudun is built, in the diocese of Chartres. 3 famous monks, Leobin, afterward Bishop of Chartres, Euphronius, and Rusticus, attended our saint to his happy death, which happened about the year 530. His body was carried to Orleans, and buried with great pomp in that city. June 18th. Saints Marcus and Marcellianus, martyrs. Marcus and Marcellianus were twin brothers of an illustrious family in Rome, who had been converted to the faith in their youth, and were honorably married. Diocletian ascending the imperial throne in 284, the heathens raised persecutions. These martyrs were thrown into prison and condemned to be beheaded. Their friends obtained a respite of the execution for 30 days, that they might prevail on them to worship the false gods. Tranquillinus and Martia, their afflicted heathen parents, in company with their sons' own wives and their little babes, endeavored to move them by the most tender entreaties and tears. St. Sebastian, an officer of the emperor's household, coming to Rome soon after their commitment, daily visited and encouraged them. The issue of the conferences was the happy conversion of the father, mother, and wives, also of Nicostratus, the public register, and soon after of Chromatius, the judge, who set the saints at liberty, and, abdicating the magistracy, retired into the country. Marcus and Marcellianus were hid by a Christian officer of the household in his apartments in the palace, but they were betrayed by an apostate and retaken. Fabian, who had succeeded Chromatius, condemned them to be bound in 2 pillars with their feet nailed to the same. In this posture they remained a day and a night, and on the following day were stabbed with lances. Reflection. We know not what we are till we have been tried. It costs us nothing to say we love God above all things, and to show the courage of martyrs at a distance from the danger, but that love is sincere which has stood the proof. Persecution shows who is a hireling, and who a true pastor, says St. Bernard. June 19th, St. Juliana Falconieri. Juliana Falconieri was born in answer to prayer in 1270. Her father built the splendid church of the Annunziata in Florence, while her uncle, Blessed Alexius, became one of the founders of the Servite order. Under his care Juliana grew up, as he said, more like an angel than a human being. Such was her modesty that she never used a mirror or gazed upon the face of a man during her whole life. The mere mention of sin made her shudder and tremble, and once hearing a scandal related, she fell into a dead swoon. Her devotion to the sorrows of Our Lady drew her to the servants of Mary, and at the age of 14 she refused an offer of marriage, and received the habit from St. Philip Benizi himself. Her sanctity attracted many novices, for whose direction she was bidden to draw up a rule, and thus, with reluctance, she became foundress of the Mantellate. She was with her children as their servant rather than their mistress, while outside her convent she led a life of apostolic charity, converting sinners, reconciling enemies, and healing the sick by sucking with her own lips their ulcerous sores. She was sometimes wrapped for whole days in ecstasy, and her prayers saved the Servite order when it was in danger of being suppressed. She was visited in her last hour by angels in the form of white doves, and Jesus himself, as a beautiful child, crowned her with a garland of flowers. She wasted away through a disease of the stomach which prevented her taking food. She bore her silent agony with constant cheerfulness, grieving only for the privation of Holy Communion. At last, when in her 70th year she had sunk to the point of death, she begged to be allowed once more to see and adore the Blessed Sacrament. It was brought to her cell and reverently laid on a corporal which was placed over her heart. At this moment she expired, and the sacred host disappeared. After her death the form of the host was found stamped upon her heart in the exact spot over which the Blessed Sacrament had been placed. Juliana died A.D. 1340. Reflection. Meditate often, says St. Paul of the Cross, on the sorrows of the Holy Mother, sorrows inseparable from those of her beloved Son. If you seek the cross, there you will find the Mother, and where the Mother is, there also is the Son. June 20th. St. Silverius, Pope and Martyr. Silverius was son of Pope Hermisdas, who had been married before he entered the ministry. Upon the death of St. Agapetus, after a vacancy of 47 days, Silverius, then subdeacon, was chosen Pope and ordained on the 8th of June, 536. Theodora, the Empress of Justinian, resolved to promote the sect of the Acephali. She endeavored to win Silverius over to her interest, and wrote to him ordering that he should acknowledge Anthimus lawful bishop, or repair in person to Constantinople and re-examine his cause on the spot. Without the least hesitation or delay, Silverius returned her a short answer, by which he peremptorily gave her to understand that he neither could nor would obey her unjust demands and betray the cause of the Catholic faith. The empress, finding that she could expect nothing from him, resolved to have him deposed. Vigilius, archdeacon of the Roman Church, a man of address, was then at Constantinople. To him the empress made her application, and finding him taken by the bait of ambition, promised to make him pope, and to bestow on him 700 pieces of gold, provided he would engage himself to condemn the Council of Chalcedon, and receive to communion the three deposed Eutychian patriarchs, Anthimus of Constantinople, Severus of Antioch, and Theodosius of Alexandria. The unhappy Vigilius, having assented to these conditions, the empress sent him to Rome, charged with a letter to the general Belisarius, commanding him to drive out Severus, and to contrive the election of Vigilius to the pontificate. Vigilius urged the general to execute the project. The more easily to carry out this project, the Pope was accused of corresponding with the enemy, and a letter was produced which was pretended to have been written by him to the King of the Goths, inviting him into the city and promising to open the gates to him. Severus was banished to Patara in Lycia. The bishop of that city received the illustrious exile with all possible marks of honor and respect, and thinking himself bound to undertake his defense, repaired to Constantinople, and spoke boldly to the emperor, terrifying him with the threats of the divine judgments for the expulsion of a bishop of so great a see, telling him, "There are many kings in the world, but there is only one pope over the Church of the whole world." It must be observed that these were the words of an Oriental bishop, and a clear confession of the supremacy of the Roman See. Justinian appeared startled at the atrocity of the proceedings, and gave orders that Severus should be sent back to Rome. But the enemies of the Pope contrived to prevent it, and he was intercepted on his road toward Rome, and carried to a desert island, where he died on the 20th of June, 538. June 21st, St. Aloysius Gonzaga. Aloysius, the eldest son of Ferdinand Gonzaga, Marquis of Castiglione, was born on the 9th of March, 1568. The first words he pronounced were the holy names of Jesus and Mary. When he was 9 years of age, he made a vow of perpetual virginity, and by a special grace was ever exempted from temptations against purity. He received his first communion at the hands of St. Charles Borromeo. At an early age he resolved to leave the world, and in a vision was directed by Our Blessed Lady to join the Society of Jesus. The Saint's mother rejoiced on learning his determination to become a religious, but his father for 3 years refused his consent. At length St. Aloysius obtained permission to enter the novitiate on the 25th of November, 1585. He took his vows after 2 years, and went through the ordinary course of philosophy and theology. He was wont to say he doubted whether without penance grace would continue to make head against nature, which, when not afflicted and chastised, tends gradually to relapse into its old state, losing the habit of suffering acquired by the labor of years. "I am a crooked piece of iron," he said, "and am come into religion to be made straight by the hammer of mortification and penance." During his last year of theology, a malignant fever broke out in Rome. The Saint offered himself for the service of the sick, and he was accepted for the dangerous duty. Several of the brothers caught the fever, and Aloysius was of the number. He was brought to the point of death, but recovered, only to fall, however, into slow fever, which carried him off after 3 months. He died repeating the holy name, a little after midnight between the 20th and 21st of June, on the octave day of Corpus Christi, being rather more than 23 years of age. Reflection. Cardinal Bellarmine, the Saint's confessor, testified that he had never mortally offended God, yet he chastised his body rigorously, rose at night to prayer, and shed many tears for his sins. Pray that, not having followed his innocence, you may yet imitate his penance. June 22nd, St. Paulinus of Nola. Paulinus was of a family which boasted of a long line of senators, prefects, and consuls. He was educated with great care, and his genius and eloquence in prose and verse were the admiration of St. Jerome and St. Augustine. He had more than doubled his wealth by marriage, and was one of the foremost men of his time. Though he was the chosen friend of saints, and had a great devotion to St. Felix of Nola, he was still only a catechumen, trying to serve 2 masters. But God drew him to Himself along the way of sorrows and trials. He received baptism, withdrew into Spain to be alone, and then, in consort with his holy wife, sold all their vast estates in various parts of the empire, distributing their proceeds so prudently that St. Jerome says east and west were filled with his alms. He was then ordained priest and retired to Nola in Campania. There he rebuilt the Church of St. Felix with great magnificence, and served it night and day, living a life of extreme abstinence and toil. In 409 he was chosen bishop, and for more than 30 years so ruled as to be conspicuous in an age blessed with many great and wise bishops. St. Gregory the Great tells us that when the Vandals of Africa had made a descent on Campania, Paulinus spent all he had in relieving the distress of his people and redeeming them from slavery. At last there came a poor widow, her only son, who had been carried off by the son-in-law of the Vandal king. "Such as I have I give thee," said the saint to her. "We will go to Africa, and I will give myself for your son." Having overborne her resistance, they went, and Paulinus was accepted in place of the widow's son, and employed as gardener. After a time the king found out, by divine interposition, that his son-in-law's slave was the great Bishop of Nola. He at once set him free, granting him also the freedom of all the townsmen of Nola who were in slavery. One who knew him well says he was meek as Moses, priest-like as Aaron, innocent as Samuel, tender as David, wise as Solomon, apostolic as Peter, loving as John, cautious as Thomas, keen-sighted as Stephen, fervent as Apollos. He died in 431. Reflection. "Go to Campania," writes St. Augustine, "there study Paulinus, that choice servant of God. With what generosity, with what still greater humility, he has flung from him the burden of this world's grandeurs, to take on him the yoke of Christ, and in his service, how serene and unobtrusive his life." June 23.— ST. Etheldreda, Abbess. Born and brought up in the fear of God, her mother and 3 sisters are numbered among the saints. Etheldreda had but one aim in life, to devote herself to his service in the religious state. Her parents, however, had other views for her, and, in spite of her tears and prayers, she was compelled to become the wife of Tombercht, a tributary of the Mercian king. She lived with him as a virgin for 3 years, and at his death retired to the Isle of Ely, that she might apply herself wholly to heavenly things. This happiness was but short-lived, for Egfrid, the powerful king of Northumbria, pressed his suit upon her with such eagerness that she was forced into a second marriage. Her life at his court was that of an ascetic rather than a queen. She lived with him not as a wife but as a sister, and observing a scrupulous regularity of discipline, devoted her time to works of mercy and love. After 12 years she retired with her husband's consent to Coldingham Abbey, which was then under the rule of St. Ebba, and received the veil from the hands of St. Wilfrid. As soon as Etheldreda had left the court of her husband, he repented of having consented to her departure, and followed her, meaning to bring her back by force. She took refuge on a headland on the coast near Coldingham, and here a miracle took place, for the waters forced themselves a passage round the hill, barring the further advance of Egfrid. The saint remained on this island refuge for 7 days, till the king, recognizing the divine will, agreed to leave her in peace. God, who by a miracle confirmed the saint's vocation, will not fail us if, with a single heart, we elect for Him. In 672 she returned to Ely, and founded there a double monastery. The nunnery she governed herself, and was by her example a living rule of perfection to her sisters. Some time after her death, in 679, her body was found incorrupt, and St. Bede records many miracles worked by her relics. Reflection. The soul cannot truly serve God while it is involved in the distractions and pleasures of the world. Etheldreda knew this, and chose rather to be a servant of Christ her Lord than the mistress of an earthly court. Resolve, in whatever state you are, to live absolutely detached from the world, and to separate yourself as much as possible from it. June 24th. St. John the Baptist. The birth of St. John was foretold by an angel of the Lord to his father, Zachary, who was offering incense in the temple. It was the office of St. John to prepare the way for Christ, and before he was born into the world he began to live for the incarnate God. Even in the womb he knew the presence of Jesus and of Mary, and he leaped with joy at the glad coming of the Son of Man. In his youth he remained hidden, because he for whom he waited was hidden also. But before Christ's public life began, a divine impulse led St. John into the desert. There, with locusts for his food and haircloth on his skin, in silence and in prayer, he chastened his own soul. Then, as crowds broke in upon his solitude, he warned them to flee from the wrath to come, and gave them the baptism of penance, while they confessed their sins. At last there stood in the crowd one whom St. John did not know, till a voice within told him that it was his Lord. With the baptism of St. John, Christ began his penance for the sins of his people, and St. John saw the Holy Ghost descend in bodily form upon him. Then the saint's work was done. He had but to point his own disciples to the Lamb. He had but to decrease as Christ increased. He saw all men leave him and go after Christ. "I told you," he said, "that I am not the Christ. The friend of the bridegroom rejoiceth because of the bridegroom's voice. This my joy therefore is fulfilled." St. John had been cast in the fortress of Machaerus by a worthless tyrant whose crimes he had rebuked, and he was to remain there till he was beheaded at the will of a girl who danced before this wretched king. In this time of despair, if St. John could have known despair, some of his old disciples visited him. St. John did not speak to them of himself, but he sent them to Christ that they might see the proofs of his mission. Then the eternal truth pronounced the panegyric of the saint who had lived and breathed for him alone. "Verily I say unto you, among them that are born of women, there hath not risen a greater than John the Baptist." Reflection. St. John was great before God because he forgot himself and lived for Jesus Christ, who is the source of all greatness. Remember that you are nothing. Your own will and your own desires can only lead to misery and sin. Therefore sacrifice every day some one of your natural inclinations to the Sacred Heart of our Lord, and learn little by little to lose yourself in Him. June 25th. St. Prosper of Aquitaine, St. William of Montevergine. St. Prosper was born at Aquitaine in the year 403. His works show that in his youth he had happily applied himself to all the branches both of polite and sacred learning. On account of the purity and sanctity of his manners, he is called by those of his age a holy and venerable man. Our saint does not appear to have been any more than a layman, but being of great virtue and of extraordinary talents and learning, he wrote several works in which he ably refuted the errors of heresy. St. Leo the Great, being chosen Pope in 440, invited St. Prosper to Rome, made him his secretary, and employed him in the most important affairs of the Church. Our saint crushed the Pelagian heresy, which began again to raise its head in that capital, and its final overthrow is said to be due to his zeal, learning, and unwearied endeavours. The date of his death is uncertain, but he was still living in 463. St. William, having lost his father and mother in his infancy, was brought up by his friends in great sentiments of piety, and at 15 years of age, out of an earnest desire to lead a penitential life, he left Piedmont, his native country, made an austere pilgrimage to St. James in Galicia, and afterward retired into the kingdom of Naples, where he chose for his abode a desert mountain, and lived in perpetual contemplation, and the exercises of most rigorous penitential austerities. Finding himself discovered and his contemplation interrupted, he changed his habitation, and settled in a place called Montevergine, situated between Nola and Benevento, in the same kingdom. But his reputation followed him, and he was obliged by two neighboring priests to permit certain fervent persons to live with him, and to imitate his ascetic practices. Thus, in 1119, was laid the foundation of the religious congregation called de Montevergine. The saint died on the 25th of June, 1142. June 26th. Saints John and Paul, martyrs. These two saints were both officers in the army under Julian the Apostate, and received the crown of martyrdom probably in 362. They glorified God by a double victory. They despised the honors of the world, and triumphed over its threats and torments. They saw many wicked men prosper in their impiety, but were not dazzled by their example. They considered that worldly prosperity which attends impunity and sin is the most dreadful of all judgments. And how false and short-lived was this glittering prosperity of Julian, who in a moment fell into the pit which he himself had dug. But the martyrs, by the momentary labor of their conflict, purchased an immense weight of never-fading glory. Their torments were, by their heroic patience and invincible virtue and fidelity, a spectacle worthy of God, who looked down upon them from the throne of His glory, and held His arm stretched out to strengthen them, and to put on their heads immortal crowns in the happy moment of their victory. Reflection. The Saints always accounted that they had done nothing for Christ so long as they had not resisted to blood, and by pouring forth the last drop completed their sacrifice. Every action of our lives ought to spring from this fervent motive, and we should consecrate ourselves to the divine service with our whole strength. We must always bear in mind that we owe to God all that we are, and, after all we can do, are unprofitable servants and do only what we are bound to do. June 27th, St. Ladislas, King. Ladislas I, son of Vila, King of Hungary, was born in 1041. By the pertinacious importunity of the people, he was compelled, much against his own inclination, to ascend the throne in 1080. He restored the good laws and discipline which St. Stephen had established, and which seem to have been obliterated by the confusion of the times. Chastity, meekness, gravity, charity, and piety were from his infancy the distinguishing parts of his character. Avarice and ambition were his sovereign aversion. So perfectly had the maxims of the Gospel extinguished in him all propensity to those base passions. His life in the palace was most austere. He was frugal and abstemious, but most liberal to the Church and the poor. Vanity, pleasure, or idle amusements had no share in his actions or time, because all his moments were consecrated to the exercises of religion and the duties of his station, in which he had only the divine will in view, and sought only God's greater honor. He watched over a strict and impartial administration of justice, was generous and merciful to his enemies, and vigorous in the defense of his country and the Church. He drove the Huns out of his territories, and vanquished the Poles, Russians, and Tartars. He was preparing to command, as general-in-chief, the great expedition of the Christians against the Saracens for the recovery of the Holy Land, when God called him to Himself on the 30th of July, 1095. Reflection. The Saints filled all their moments with good works and great actions, and, whilst they labored for an immortal crown, the greatest share of worldly happiness of which this life is capable fell in their way, without being even looked for by them. In their afflictions themselves, virtue afforded them the most solid comfort, pointed out the remedy, and converted their tribulations into the greatest advantages. June 28th, St. Irenaeus, Bishop, Martyr. This saint was born about the year 120. He was a Grecian, probably a native of Lesser Asia. His parents, who were Christians, placed him under the care of the great St. Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna. It was in so holy a school that he learned that sacred science which rendered him afterward a great ornament of the Church and the terror of her enemies. St. Polycarp cultivated his rising genius, and formed his mind to piety by precepts and example, and the zealous scholar was careful to reap all the advantages which were offered him by the happiness of such a master. Such was his veneration for his tutor's sanctity, that he observed every action, and whatever he saw in that holy man, the better to copy his example and learn his spirit. He listened to his instructions with an insatiable ardor, and so deeply did he engrave them on his heart that the impressions remained most lively even to his old age. In order to confute the heresies of his age, this father made himself acquainted with the most absurd conceits of their philosophers, by which means he was qualified to trace up every error to its sources and set it in its full light. St. Polycarp sent St. Irenaeus into Gaul in company with some priest. He was himself ordained priest of the Church of Lyons by St. Pothinus. St. Pothinus, having glorified God by his happy death in the year 177, our saint was chosen the second bishop of Lyons. By his preaching, he in a short time converted almost that whole country to the faith. He wrote several works against heresy, and at last, with many others, suffered martyrdom about the year 202 under the Emperor Severus at Lyons. Reflection. Fathers and mothers and heads of families, spiritual and temporal, should bear in mind that inferiors will not be corrected by words alone, but that example is likewise needful. June 29th, St. Peter, Apostle. Peter was of Bethsaida in Galilee, and as he was fishing on the lake was called by our Lord to be one of his apostles. He was poor and unlearned, but candid, eager, and loving. In his heart first of all grew up the conviction, and from his lips came the confession, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And so our Lord chose him, and fitted him to be the rock of his church, his vicar on earth, the head and prince of his apostles, the centre and very principle of the church's oneness, the source of all spiritual powers, and the unerring teacher of his truth. All Scripture is alive with him, but after Pentecost he stands out in the full grandeur of his office. He fills the vacant apostolic throne, admits the Jews by thousands into the fold, opens it to the Gentiles in the person of Cornelius, founds and for a time rules the church at Antioch, and sends Mark to found that of Alexandria. 10 years after the Ascension he went to Rome, the centre of the majestic Roman Empire, where were gathered the glories and the wealth of the earth, and all the powers of evil. There he established his chair, and for 25 years labored with St. Paul in building up the great Roman Church. He was crucified by order of Nero and buried on the Vatican Hill. He wrote 2 epistles and suggested and approved the Gospel of St. Mark. 260 years after St. Peter's martyrdom came the open triumph of the Church. Pope St. Sylvester, with bishops and clergy and the whole body of the faithful, went through Roman procession to the Vatican Hill, singing the praises of God till the 7 hills rang again. The first Christian emperor, laying aside his diadem and his robes of state, began to dig the foundations of St. Peter's Church. And now on the site of the old church stands the noblest temple ever raised by man. Beneath the towering canopy lies the great apostles, in death as in life, undivided. And there is the chair of St. Peter. All around rest the martyrs of Christ, popes, saints, doctors, from east and west, and high over all the words, "Thou art Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." It is the threshold of the apostles and the centre of the world. Reflection. Peter still lives on in his successors, and rules and feeds the flock committed to him. The reality of our devotion to him is the surest test of the purity of our faith. June 30th. St. Paul. St. Paul was born at Tarsus of Jewish parents, and studied at Jerusalem at the feet of Gamaliel. While still a young man, he held the clothes of those who stoned the proto-martyr Stephen, and in his restless zeal he pressed on to Damascus, breathing out threatening and slaughter against the disciples of Christ. But near Damascus a light from heaven struck him to the earth. He heard a voice which said, "Why persecutest thou me?" He saw the form of him who had been crucified for his sins, and then for 3 days he saw nothing more. He awoke from his trance another man, a new creature in Jesus Christ. He left Damascus for a long retreat in Arabia, and then, at the call of God, he carried the gospel to the uttermost limits of the world, and for years he lived and labored with no thought but the thought of Christ, crucified, no desire but to spend and be spent for him. He became the apostle of the Gentiles, whom he had been taught to hate, and wished himself anathema for his own countrymen who sought his life. Perils by land and sea could not damp his courage, nor toil and suffering and age dulled the tenderness of his heart. At last he gave blood for blood. In his youth he had imbibed the false zeal of the Pharisees at Jerusalem, the holy city of the former dispensation. With St. Peter he consecrated Rome, our holy city, by his martyrdom, and poured into its church all his doctrine with all his blood. He left 14 epistles which have been a fountainhead of the Church's doctrine, the consolation and delight of her greatest saints. His interior life, so far as words can tell it, lies open before us in these divine writings, the life of one who has died forever to himself and risen again in Jesus Christ. "In what," says St. Chrysostom, "in what did this blessed one gain an advantage over the other apostles? How comes it that he lives in all men's mouths throughout the world? Is it not through the virtues of his epistles? Nor will his work cease while the race of man continues. Even now, like a most chivalrous knight, he stands in our midst, and takes captive every thought to the obedience of Christ." Reflection. St. Paul complains that all seek the things which are their own, and not the things which are Christ's. See if these words apply to you. and resolve to give yourself without reserve to God. End of section 13. Recording by Maria Therese.